We then went through a second cycle that we could date from 2003 to 2006. It could have started in September 2001, but I don't like that, giving them the dignity of that, because partly also the altered globalization movement extended further. But this second cycle is essentially transformed into an anti-war movement. In the US, it was an anti-war movement and an anti-Bush movement. And you could see the high point of this was really February 15th in 2003, with the large global circuit of struggles against the invasion of Iraq. Now, this cycle, of course, was necessary, in some ways inevitable, made by Bush, made by the war. We had to address an urgency, but it had a very different characteristic than the altered globalization movements. It was, rather than having a multiplicity of agendas and a multiplicity of organizational structures, a multiplicity of tactics, it quickly became a unified movement with a single agenda, an extremely important single agenda, but single nonetheless, and often with centralized organizational structures. That varied sometimes in different countries, but in the UK and the US at least, that was largely true. And I think the waning of enthusiasm and effect from February 15, 2003 on through 2006 was partly due to this transformation of the form of the movements, of the lack of multiplicity. So instead, whereas a previous generation had told the activists of the 1990s, really, and it's really younger than me, is that generation that leads this, at least in the US. An older generation told them, in order to be effective, you have to be unified, you have to have a single agenda, you have to have spokespeople, you have to have a single leadership. In fact, they've discovered exactly the opposite. With the anti-war movements, when we had a single agenda, a single leadership, there were spokespeople, that was exactly the lack of effect. I mean, it was a decline of the movements, both in effect and in participation. I think that we're now entering a third cycle. In some ways, maybe Rostock could be the opening of a third cycle of struggles, and it would have. And this is a cycle that's born after the defeat of the U.S. I mean, after the defeat of the war on Iraq, after its failure, and so no longer is that dominating the political scene. What we have, in some ways, and what we saw in Rostock in certain ways, was the reappearance of this multiplicity of tactics and multiplicity of groups. What we have to recognize in this third phase, though, is a way to address, it can't just be a return to the altered globalization movements. If it is going to truly open this third phase, let's say, it has to rather address the limitations that we all recognized of the altered globalization movements. And in some ways, I think it is transforming, in some ways rooting and localizing many of the issues that are organized around the summits. Let me just give you one example of the G8 in Japan that took place during this summer. I went to the G8 meetings in Sapporo. There was first in Tokyo, there were anti-G8 forum, and then also in Sapporo that was near the site. And of course, by European standards, there was not nearly the numbers of participation. I mean, there was the big demonstration was maybe 3,000 people. So it's a completely different context in Japan, partly due to traditions, but also due to repression, which was extraordinary. But what interested me is the most pressing question in Japan was really about precarious labor. And in some ways, they're starting to use the terms that Europeans have used. Japan, even more than Europe, is in some ways an anomaly in the world for the expectation of guaranteed work and a continuity of work. That they had a long phase, even more than Europe, of the expectation that everyone would get a job that would be taken care of for life, that would be guaranteed. So that that notion of precarity is even more profound, and the kind of betrayal of the lack of guaranteed work and the social pathologies that result from it. So this question about precarity now in Japan seemed to me to be using the G8 as pretext and for revolting against a real and concrete and present problem.